Crystal Watkins is a team leader for the Public Water Supply Team in Dallas-Fort Worth Region Office in the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. She has a BS in Biology and MS in Wildlife and Fisheries Science from Texas A&M University. Crystal has worked for TCEQ since 2012 as an environmental investigator and now in a management role. Her duties include conducting drinking water investigations, managing a team of environmental investigators, and helping with interpretation of rules and regulations. Please welcome Crystal Watkins.
All right, good morning, everybody. As Jackie said, I'm Crystal Watkins with the DFW Region Office, and my goal for today's presentation is to at least keep you from getting one violation from your regional investigators. My goal is for you not to have any violations, but that's my goal for today. So what we're going to talk about is what is a comprehensive compliance investigation, what should you expect from that investigation, and some common violations that we see in the field, as well as some ways that you can make sure that you're compliant with those violations, and some tools for your operator toolbox. So why does the TCEQ have to do CCIs? And the reason is because EPA says so. So just like we have to tell y'all what rules and regulations you have to follow, EPA gives us rules and regulations we have to follow in order to maintain our primacy. And so primacy just means that we have the ability to set rules and regulations for the drinking water program in the state. Now, if you talk to EPA or if you go to an EPA presentation, they will call this a sanitary survey. This is going to be the same exact investigation that your region folks come out to, but we call it a comprehensive compliance investigation. For our investigations, for all community water systems, we have to come out once every 3 years. And for our non-community water systems, we come out once every 5 years. And so these inspections, along with correcting those violations, is important in protecting public health and the safety of drinking water. So our protocol usually is that we will contact whoever's our primary contact on Drinking Water Watch or in our investigation reports. And we will set up a schedule usually within 2 weeks of when you get that phone call. We know y'all are all very busy people, so we can accommodate schedules, times, etc. You will also get a confirmation email similar to the one above here that will also provide a list of records that's going to be reviewed during the CCI. Now, this is going to be one of the most important slides of the presentation, and is how can you prepare for this CCI? So, like I said, we're going to send you a list of records. What you're going to want to do is go and gather those records. You can do it in either way. The way we usually see is the most successful is our records are labeled 1 through like 25. If you want to set it up with, say, this is number 1, this is number 2, that allows the investigation to go a little bit faster and a little bit smoother during this time. What I highly, highly recommend is you do something called a pre-inspection walkthrough. We have seen that water systems that kind of do their own internal inspection before our compliance inspection are the ones that tend to have less violations. So this is going to be things like looking at leaks, looking at your vent screens, looking at any fences, mowing your grass, and please make sure that you check your chlorine residual. That's very, very important. We like to say that there's something called a TCEQ bump, and so we know that sometimes people will bump up their chlorine really high, prepare for TCEQ, and I hear laughs because you know some of y'all do it. We appreciate that because we do not want to have to come out and cite a violation for low chlorine. If you do notice a problem, do not wait for us to come out to fix the problem. And then finally, if you have any preventative maintenance, you might want to check, our things. Is your biggest preventative maintenance we see is maintaining the area around your facilities. So with your inspection, or your CCI, there's going to be a couple different parts of it. You're going to have an interest meeting where we're going to introduce ourselves, talk through the flow. Sometimes I know for me as an investigator, I like to do paperwork first, but when it's gonna be 108 degrees at 2 o'clock, I'm not trying to be out in the field. So they might do field work in the morning versus in the afternoon. We're gonna review our records, and we're going to go to all your applicable facilities. We're finally going to go into the distribution system, and to wrap it all up, we're gonna do something called an exit interview, and you'll get an exit interview form that notes any violations or corrections we are going to recommend. We're gonna outline our objectives. If there's any PPE, we're going to ask what should we have, and then, of course, identify anybody who is present. Now, one thing I do want to highlight, just because this is something we do see quite a bit, is what is a connection. So the definition of a connection is a single-family residential unit or each commercial industrial establishment. So if you just serve homes, one connection is going to equal one home. However, if you are going to serve something that's being served by a master meter, apartment buildings, RV parks, the 1 meter to 1 connection does not work here. So you'll have to count each individual unit that is behind that master meter. And you might have heard in some of the previous presentations, there is the talk about the 8-to-1 rule. So during the last legislative session, RV slots, if there's 8 RV slots in the park, it counts for 1 connection. So you might see some of your investigators come through, ask you if you serve RV parks, and you might see your connection count grow just because of that new rule. These are all the records that we require. And one thing I do want to highlight, I know that some people think paperwork is not the most important part, but I will say this is probably the most important part. We have had several situations in the region in which we had a confirmed waterborne disease outbreak, and having great paperwork was the difference between a water system issuing a do not use or do not drink order. And so a do not use, do not drink order is even more restrictive than a boil water notice. So here's some of our requirements. Let's talk about our monthly operating reports. So we kind of call it a monthly operating report because we borrowed the term from surface water, but this is just going to be the amount of water you're using weekly or daily, the amount of chemicals you're usually using weekly and daily, and your disinfectant residual that you're using weekly or daily. So you can have this all in one document, or you can keep it separate. That is going to be what is best for your water system. And if you have less than 250 connections, you have to monitor weekly. And if you have more than 250 connections, you have to monitor every 7 days. One thing I really want to highlight is the wording difference between weekly and every 7 days. So your disinfectant residual record monitoring has to be done once every 7 days. And that's going to be different than your volume of water treated, that's once every week. So for a volume of water, if you monitor on a Sunday and then next week you monitor on a Thursday, you're compliant with the rule. But you would not be compliant with the rule for monitoring every 7 days because you went more than 7 days. What we tend to find is most water systems will just monitor everything once every 7 days. Some of the common mistakes that we see is not recording the amount of water according to what the rule says. So we see people doing it once a month or twice a month. If you have less than 250 connections, you're going to want to do it once a week. If you're more than 250 connections, you want to do it every day, including the weekends. So that's one of the other things that we note as well. Another thing that we see with our chemical usage data is not recording how much chemical is actually used, but maybe counting how many bottles that you put back into the reservoir. So it's really important to know how much chemical you're using because you can determine that information is used to determine where your chlorine residuals should be based on demand and how much volume of water you're treating. So you want to make sure you are keeping accurate records of how much you're using. So the different ways we've seen, if you have a clear barrel and you're using sodium hypochlorite, we usually see people will mark on the side of on the barrel and then have a conversion of how many inches equals gallons. If you have a blue barrel, we usually see people use a chlorine stick, same thing, they put it in, note how many inches have been noted, are used, and then go from there. Again, I kind of talked about the each week versus once every 7 days, so make sure that you are keeping track with that. Another important thing is not recording the locations of your disinfectant residuals. So one of the rules we have that we are checking during our investigation is determining if your disinfectant residual sites are representative of your distribution system. And so if you do not have that location, then that will be hard for us to determine that it's good for compliance. Another thing we also do in addition to CCIs is complaint investigations. So one of the things your investigator is going to ask is, can I see your chlorine disinfectant residual records? And if you have those locations, we can use that information to substantiate or not substantiate a complaint. Tank inspection forms. So the rule says that all ground storage tanks and pressure tanks have to be inspected annually. And if your pressure tank has an inspection port, you have to go inside and do an interior inspection once every 5 years. Another common thing that we see is not necessarily a violation, but is something we might note as something called an additional issue. You want to make sure that each one of your ground storage and pressure tanks is on its own separate inspection form. If you just do one that says everything is good, or if you have an inspection form for all tanks and there's one that's noted a problem, well, we can't tell which one is a problem that needs to be addressed. You can do the inspections, water system personnel can do the inspections themselves. I know that is something that we've ran into where people think you have to hire an outside contractor, and that's not absolutely true. If you're brave enough to climb up the elevator, you have at it. I'm not, and so you can hire a contractor or send your bravest employee up there to do the inspection. I wanted to show some things that we have seen in our inspection. So this is actually a dead mockingbird in the ground storage tank. This was the first tank of the day for the inspection, and so I climbed up there, and then I climbed 13 other tanks for the next 2 days, just to make sure there was no other birds, and luckily there was no other ones. We also can see rust on the inside of your pressure tank, so that can tell us that you might have some issues with your pressure tank and it may need to be put out of service for maintenance. And then if there's any open holes or whatnot, you want to make sure that you're addressing that and fixing it, because these are going to be ways of that pathogens can come, or birds can enter into your ground storage tanks or your elevated storage tanks. Here's what the forms look like. This is a TCQ form that you can find on the TCQ website. You can use this form. We see quite a bit of people use this form, or you can use something that you have created yourself. You just want to make sure that your internal inspection form is following the requirements of 29046M. 1. Problems we find, again, one tank equals one form. Again, that might not necessarily be a violation, but it's something you want to make sure you're doing as part of your pre-investigation check. Make sure to identify the tanks, especially if one of your tanks is in fairly bad condition, so we can match them up. And this is also important for complaints too. Sometimes if we see someone saying they're complaining about brown water, is it really a manganese iron issue, or is it because one of your tanks is really rusty on the inside? And not inspecting your pressure tank once every 5 years with an inspection port. Flushing logs. So the rule says that all dead end mains have to be flushed once a month, and then you have to have the dates of the dead end mains. There's a lot of other water systems which we are very appreciative of that will do a lot more best management practices. So they'll put in how many gallons they flush, the chlorine residual, things like that. That is absolutely great. The requirement says just the dates. So you just want to make sure you put the dates. And I also recommend putting the addresses of where you're flushing. So when we're looking at your distribution map and we're identifying your dead end mains, we can ensure that those are being flushed on a monthly basis. And then biggest thing we see is not having a flushing log. So make sure to have one. If your system is looped, just make sure that you have a map to show us that shows that it is looped, and therefore you don't need a flushing log. Now, the rule also does say you should flush on customer basis. So even though you're a loop system, you may still have a flushing log because you are flushing based on customer complaints. You also want to make sure that you are recording the date. So this right here where it just says water loss is not compliant. And so we would note a violation there. So one of the things I want to mention is in December 2023, there was a set of new rules that came out, a lot that came through Winter Storm Uri. And one of the big changes in terms of record keeping is going to be your plant operations manual. So before, the plant operations manual was a little bit small, a little bit skimpy. Now it has expanded to a very big document that's probably going to be very similar to one of your monitoring plans. And that rule is still going to be in 29042L, but you have to identify critical plant equipment, treatment chemicals, which are vendors. If you need backup vendors, where can you get chemical, where you can get supplies, key personnel, and other information and SOPs as needed. So if you have a certain iron filtration system or some other type of unique treatment system, you're going to want to have an SOP on how to manage that. And so the goal is that you have a junior personnel that would come in can look at your SOP, look at your plant operations manual, and operate the plant. And so this is another document that could be very helpful. And one of the reasons why we expanded the plant operations manual is that after Winter Storm Uri, there was an after action review, and a lot of operators indicated in our roundtable sessions that they were ill prepared or didn't know how to operate some of the key critical plant equipment. So our thought is, of course, let's give you more paperwork to fill out. But we're hoping with this expanded plant operations manual, we can prevent something like that happen again. Some of the things we do see is not having emergency contact information. So that is one of the key requirements of the plant operations manual, not providing enough detail, especially with the new rule change, and not updating it. So if you're a water system that went from having a well system to purchase water system, or you change from liquid to gas, we don't see a lot of people will update their facilities at that point. But make sure when you're having a significant change that you're going through things like your monitoring plan and your plant operations manual to make sure it's up to date. Backflow. So BPAT, the backflow prevention assembly test and maintenance form, is very, very important. We've seen it in the last couple of years of where having a compliant BPAT form has make or break a situation that we had. It's part of a cross-connection control program, and that cross-connection control program is to help ensure that you are protecting your water system from the outside. So that includes your customer service inspections, a plumbing ordinance if you're a governmental entity, or a customer service agreement, and then your backflow form. Your backflow devices have to be tested by a licensed tester, and then the most common cross connection is a garden hose. So someone dumps a garden hose into their swimming pool to fill it up, there's a break outside, now that chlorinated water is pulling back into the distribution system. And so if you're not aware of what backflow is, it's the undesirable reversal of flow of water or mixtures of water and other undesirable substances. So a backflow of coffee, which sounds great, you have an unlimited supply of coffee, actually is an undesirable issue because some people may have interactions with caffeine in their medication. In the end of our rules, we have a list of facilities that will qualify for having backflow. Items that are considered a health risk, you need to either have an air gap or an RPZ or RPBA, and those have to be tested annually. I will tell you, as an investigator, what I will do is take this list and I will start Googling. So I will say City of X dentist office, and I will have a list of facilities in my, that I will ask the water system if they have this information. If you are a city and you have a wastewater or pre-treatment program, that pre-treatment program is going to have a list of people who are using that water. And so that will be a great start in trying to figure out the systems that can cause a health hazard. One thing I do want to point out is that interactive water features and splash pads are considered a health hazard. So you want to make sure that those items have an RPZ and are tested on an annual basis. Some of the common items we see is having an outdated form. The form has been updated, I believe, in 2019, and want to make sure you're using the right form. If you want to use a form that's different from our standard form, then you have to obtain approval for use of an alternative backflow form. If you also are going to use an outside company to have electronic versions, you're going to need a exception to the rule for that as well. One thing we do see is that the test gauge that your backflow tester is out of date. So what you want to do is ensure that when you're looking at the backflow forms from your customers, that the tester's gauge is within a year of when the test was done. And then not keeping the original form. So if you're a facility or a system that is requiring people to submit you backflow forms, make sure to keep the original and then give them the copy. Well calibration records. So if you have a groundwater well, you have to calibrate your well once every 3 years. Now, you can either calibrate it or you can also replace it. And we had a question about this last year. You can do self-calibrations of well meters as long as you indicate what method you use and you have that information. But some of the common things we do see with this is that if people are doing self-calibration, they're not putting information about dates or what was the expected result and what the result they have was. Another new thing that has came up is emergency preparedness plans. Again, Winter Storm Uri caused a lot more paperwork to be generated. But this was a document that was only for Fort Bend and Harris counties before, and now this is included for all across the state. So if you serve one residential connection, you have to have a emergency preparedness plan. So if you're a non-community system that is a warehouse or they don't have, and you're not having anybody staying overnight, an emergency preparedness plan does not apply to you. Now, we do have options for water systems that are not financially able to do an emergency preparedness plan or put into place some of the options. So what you can do is ask for a financial waiver. There is 14 options, but there's actually a lot more because some of the options are an A and B option. And one thing I do want to point out again is that for the emergency preparedness plans, you do not have to enact it every time there's a water outage. The emergency preparedness plans come into play only when there's an extended power outage. So if you have a water leak and water goes out, that does not mean you need to enact your emergency preparedness plans. Another new requirement we have is generator maintenance in relation to emergency preparedness plans. So if you have a generator, we have a lot more rules that are in there about how to maintain your generator, and it's going to be 29046M, I believe might be 4. But pretty much one of the big things is you have to be able to run your generator, your whole system, under 30% load for at least 30 minutes once a month. And you're also going to have to check your generators once a month for a list of items that is in our new rules. And there's, on our TCQ News website or YouTube channel, I want to highlight that there is a generator maintenance series of videos that is very good, very detailed, and it can help you with some information about how to maintain your generators, as well as information about emergency preparedness plans. All right, so we got through all that paperwork. Now we're gonna go out in the field, and pretty much we're going to look at everything from where the water comes out to right before it hits into your distribution system. So some of the things I do want to point out, and these are all real photos, but those who are in these photos are protected for their identity. Make sure there's not a cow near your well. That blue thing is covering the well, and there's a pump, and there is a cow. Needless to say, the water coming out of that in that area was pretty foul. But you want to make sure you have something called a sanitary control easement that protects your well 150 feet away. And specifically, livestock are not allowed to be within 50 feet of the well. So I think that's a little bit closer than 50 feet. Now, I know some of you your pump stations are near a neighbor who has livestock, and sometimes they come right up to your fence. What you can do is do something, ask for a sanitary control easement exception. That's for when you cannot guarantee that you can keep all hazards within 150 feet away. So usually we would require you to take a raw bacteriological sample for a month to make sure that granting you this exception is not causing any contamination of the well. Next is some other well items, such as making sure that your wellhead is sealed and doesn't have a big crack. Another thing is also making sure that your well vents are gooseneck, so gooseneck is just pointing downward and is covered with a screen. Again, a lot of our rules are making sure that we are preventing any potential sources of contamination impacting the water system at different points. So this is the source water protection that we have. We do require disinfection, and despite what some of the people of Texas think, chlorine is not going to kill you, but we get those complaints quite a bit. But we want to make sure you're disinfecting and your equipment is being used appropriately. One thing we do see is that people will use household bleach, and that is not appropriate of what you want to use. You want to use something NSF standard 60. And from what I've heard, and I know back in the day when I started, there was a list of bleach that you could find at common grocery stores. I think someone found out that we were recommending their product and was like, we cannot guarantee this. So now you have to go back and we have to use NSF standard 60. There are vendors or manufacturers that will sell you NSF standard 60 bleach in that small gallon size. You can reach out to your appropriate vendor for that information. I always love seeing the trash can, like holding area. Just make sure that you're using an appropriate container that can hold the volume of liquid that is there, as well as making sure it's not open to the atmosphere. You also want to make sure that some of your facilities are protected against adverse weather. So having your disinfection pumps out in the open where it can be beat by hail and storm and rain is probably not a good idea. Water storage, so we ask that you are making sure that items with your pressure tanks and ground storage tanks are meeting AWWA standards. So the black poly tank is not an AWWA approved tank. However, I have seen that TCQ will provide exceptions to the rule for using a black poly tank. I will tell you, if you try to put in an exception for a white poly tank, you're going to get it denied. And that's because we've actually seen algae has grown into white poly tanks that are left outside. So even if you may not necessarily have an AWWA approval, you can always ask for an exception. If you provide the information, there's a good chance that you can get it approved. Another thing we also see is that this is your overflow valve. You want to make sure that it has a gap no bigger than 1/16 of an inch. And so that is a very common violation that we would note during a CCI. So your distribution lines have to be underground and not just crossing a creek like that held together by duct tape and a prayer. What was great in this instance is that as you go along the creek, you can see lots of broken parts where it had broken and the water system fixed it. And yeah, it was not fun. This is also a water line that is less than the requirement underground. I think it was less than 2 feet underground. So if somebody was doing road construction, like if you're in the county comes in and starts breaking up the road, well, now they hit your water line. And just, we have a general housekeeping violation, so you just want to make sure your facilities are in good working order. Make sure that your grass is not knee-high. Make sure that you take all the trash and your pump station away from your facilities. You want to make sure that you're not providing a haven for vectors or critters to kind of stay around your area. I will tell you, one of my investigators went on investigation, and when he opened up the pump station, there was like 200 cats in there. And there was a hole, and the guy said, heck, like 2 weeks ago, there was double the amount, but some illness got them. Isn't that what you love to hear? And get this, it was a restaurant. Don't you love to hear that? So, you know. So yeah, just make sure that you're not providing a haven for ill and sick cats to come around your well and potentially pass on any vectors. Can anybody guess what this kind of piece of equipment is? Pressure tank, right? It's a repair. You know what that is? A screw. So imagine, so this is their fix for fixing a leak, and while I applaud their ingenuity, I don't want to know what happens when it blows. Another thing is what we also see, I think in this picture, my staff member found a 6-foot long snake skin. And so I always make a joke that, like, if I get bit by a snake, you're going to enforcement. That's not anything in the rule, but you know, you know, if I see a snake or if I get close to one, we're not gonna have a good time. Just rustiness, just making sure you are taking care of your facilities. And we understand that things get broken down over time, but just make sure that you're taking care of them, because if you continue to ignore some of this preventative maintenance issues, it's gonna become a bigger problem later. Finally, make sure your fence is actually intruder resistance. This fence, I'm pretty sure that, I could have climbed over it or walked over it. So you wanna make sure that your fence isn't leaning, because we're trying to protect intruders. You also wanna make sure that your barbed wire is facing outward, because we're trying to prevent people from coming in, not prevent people from coming out, so. And then make sure it's free of brush and everything that could compromise your barbed wire. Another thing I wanted to point out was this new rule about the generators in association with EPP. You have to have monthly inspections of your generators, and you want to make sure that you're running it at least 30% load for at least 30 minutes or whatever the manufacturer's requirement is. So that way we just know that, it's ready to up and run when it's ready, when it's time to go. So we've gone through paperwork. We've done through facilities. Now we're in the home stretch and we're going into distribution. So this is where you really want to make sure that your chlorine residual is above the minimum. If it's really high, we might cite an additional issue, but it's not a violation. But make sure it's above the minimum of 0.2 or 0.5, depending on what type of chlorination facility you're in. You also want to make sure you have 35 PSI. Now, don't be surprised if your investigator wants to go to the dead end, the furthest point in your distribution system, because for us, that's going to be the most vulnerable part. So if you have a good residual and pressure at the dead end main, you could be assured that for probably the majority of the system, you're fine. Another thing we also might ask is if you have an area that has a lot of low usage, we might ask to go there as well. So you've gone through the inspections, and because you remember Crystal's presentation, you got one less violation, but you still maybe had some record reviews or some other things that the investigator needs to check. So this is just a preliminary notification. Your official notification is going to be the notice of violation. And so just to give you some terms, if it's an AV, it's alleged violation that the investigator noted. If it's a PV, it's a potential violation, which is something that the investigator thinks it can go either way. An RR is a record request, so we might ask you to provide us records within 14 days. And if somebody notes a record request, you want to make sure to get it to them, because if you don't, then that record request would become a violation. Some investigators will also note additional issues, which are known as AIs. Additional issues are not violations, but they're items that could become violations if they're not addressed. If it's not a super busy year for your investigators, you should get a copy of you should get something called a summary of investigation findings and a notice of violation if you have any violations. If everything was great and good, you're gonna get that magical golden letter that's called a general compliance letter. So your timeframes for resolving violations is gonna be based on the NOV letter date. There's really only one violation that we will note that is based on the exit interview form, and it's for chlorine. So if you have low chlorine, you have 24 hours to raise your residual up to the minimum compliant levels, or you have to put a boil water notice at the end of that 24 hours. So if you don't do that, then that's automatic enforcement, but that's the only time you really are going to see a hard deadline in your exit interview form. So some items I wanted to highlight here is that there's a lot of helpful guidance documents that we have on our website. Of course, we have the rules. Managing small public water systems. I know our small business and local government assistance program has been working on these items called compliance notebooks. So pretty much if you fill out the information in this compliance notebook, I think it meets everything for the paperwork part of the rule. There is some copies, I think, for non-community systems that I did see in the TA room. So pick those up and take a look at them. Our TCQ website is better than it was in the past. But there's lots of really good resources that we have. So I highly recommend going there. Also, our TCQ YouTube page has a lot of videos and trainings that can really help out if you need, so I highly recommend to go there. Some of the other helpful people we have is small business and local government assistance specialists. So if you talk to someone with small business and you have a compliance issue, that is kept between y'all two. They would not come back and tell Crystal, this water system doesn't have a disinfection equipment. They will help you get into compliance. Also, financial, managerial, and technical assistance is a free service to everybody, and these highly qualified people will come to you at the time you need in order to ensure that you are being compliant with everything. And then I promise we don't bite regional, so your regional investigators are really good resources. There's a couple of people in here who call us and we can give them some information. We don't want violations. We don't want to cite violations. We just want to make sure you're compliant. So if you have any questions or whatnot, your regional folks and Water Supply Division are going to be a very helpful resource for you to use. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I could take questions.
There are a few questions from the virtual audience.
Okay. Okay.
When we have an industrial facility, which it's with its own PWS, would our connection be to the buildings with sinks and restrooms, or would it include lines that serve individual safety showers?
So I would think it would be to any buildings. So if you have an industrial facility that has any buildings that are providing water, so I think safety showers may count towards that connection count as well, because people are going to be exposed to water through those safety showers.
Okay, we've got a couple more. Is the interior inspection required for both GSTs and HPTs, or just HPTs?
So it's going to be required for both. However, with the ground storage tank, it's going to be part of your annual inspection because it's a little easier to get into your ground storage tank. But the pressure tank is only when it's has an inspection port.
Okay. What is the process to make changes to your approved daily CL2 residual sites to capture a better representation of your system?
So one thing you're going to want to do is make sure you update your monitoring plan. And if you're a system that is required to update your monitoring plan with changes or every 5 years, you're going to want to make sure you send a copy to the monitoring plan team. For us in the region, if you're small enough, it's just making sure that you've updated your locations on your monitoring plan, showing that you have changed your chlorine residual sample locations.
Okay. Should every building, not temporary, have a BF preventer?
It depends on what is on being served by that building. So there are some backflow preventers that are needed for garden hose or outside hose connections. But it's going to depend on what that facility is actually doing on the inside. So if you're a chemical manufacturing building that's using water for your process, you absolutely need an RPZ at the meter. But there is going to be some requirements for garden hose and atmospheric vacuum breaker and some other items that are needed for buildings that are, usually you just install it and inspect it, and after that you don't have to do an annual inspection.
Okay, thank you. And then how do we document generator maintenance? Is there an official form?
I think they're going to work on a form, but what you might want to do is take our rules, and what you can do is either create your own spreadsheet or document, or just have copies of the rules and do check marks so you can make sure you can show that you did do that maintenance, and also make sure to put the date on there.
Okay, and how can they get a copy of the compliance notebook that you showed towards the end of the presentation?
So those are going to be also on our website. So if you want to go on our website and type in compliance notebook, you can. I recommend going to Google and typing in compliance notebook TCQ, and it usually will send you directly to those notebooks.
Awesome, thanks. One last one. On a black poly tank, does it have to be black poly, or could it use a poly tank painted black on the outside?
That's going to be a tough one. I'm not sure what plan review would approve. I know if it's a black, one of the things I would have or concern about with a black painted poly tank is the degradation of that paint over time in the sun. And if it's a clear tank, is that going to allow out sunlight in to allow algae. So that's going to be something you want to talk with plan review team. And if you're going to want to go that route, you want to probably put in a mechanism that shows how you're going to ensure that the integrity of that paint is going to be inspected and whatnot.
Okay, so regarding the BPAT information, as you know, as long as the water entity is informing the customers that they have BPAT inspections that are due, does that suffice? Because a lot of our district, customer actually owns the BPAT on their side of the meter.
So for BPATs that are in an annual inspection, you still want to make sure that they're getting those inspected. If you just mostly serve residential homes, then you're probably going to have a double check that only needs to be inspected upon installation. But for us, even if you send a notification, we still want to make sure that you're following up and making sure people are following the requirements of what they signed in their customer service agreement or whatever is in their tariff. So it would be a good start, but you want to make sure that you're still going through to make sure there's a backflow or that meter is pulled if somebody is not complying.
Okay.
For the tank inspections, if we're hiring a third party to come in to do our annual tank inspections, they're submitting to us just a report of their findings. Do we need to then take that information and fill out a form for the investigations on that tank inspection form for you guys to have?
No, you don't, because like those tank inspection forms pretty much hit every part of our rules, so you don't have to go and then put it onto our TCQ form. The TCQ form is for people who want to do their own, but if you have a third party who's doing it, and as long as they're meeting all the requirements, and a lot of them are doing a little bit more in regards to confined entry, that is perfectly fine and will suffice with complying with the rule.